Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our second in our Grid and Peril webinar series. I'm Thomas Coleman, Executive Director of SAFE's Grid Security Project. For those of you not familiar with SAFE, it's a nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on transportation, energy, and supply chain policies that advance both the economic and national security of the United States and our allied nations. For the last 20 years, we've convened business and military leaders to advance a more sustainable and resilient energy system with a primary focus on reducing our nation's oil dependence and also to complement our work on both transportation energy policy as well as power grid policy. The Safe Grid Security Project, which I lead and am executive director of, is a new initiative focused on supporting both the reliability and the resilience of our nation's power grid, understanding that grid security and national security are inextricably intertwined. This webinar here this afternoon is the second in the Grid and Peril webinar series, which looks at and presents solutions to the challenges facing the U.S. power grid as the country reindustrializes and transitions to a certain more electrified future. The present deficiencies in the power grid are threatening our nation's ability to remain both globally competitive and as a result, threatening our very own national security. The discussion today will focus on this inadequate state of the transmission infrastructure and what can be done to modernize it and prepare it for increased demand that is certainly coming, and how to make it more resilient in the face of increasingly powerful weather events, which I think we're about to experience here yet again over the next few days. Today's panel discussion will set the stage for a larger conversation with industry leaders about the growing need for investment in transmission infrastructure as a matter of economic and national security that will take place at the SAFE Summit 2024. That summit is titled Solving the Global Power Puzzle, and it will be held in Washington, D.C. on March 12th and 13th. The summit will provide an opportunity for the global community of energy, transportation, and supply chain leaders to encounter cutting-edge ideas, discover new ways of thinking, and to network with other professionals working towards the same goal of shaping policies that advance the economic and national security of the United States, its partners, and allies. So I'd like to get started. Let's get started. Joining us today are Representative Paul Tonko from New York's 20th Congressional District, Christina Hayes, who is somebody I work very closely with. I'm excited to have us joining her today, Executive Director of Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, and also Jeffrey Dennis. Jeffrey is head of the Transmission Department of the Energy Grid Deployment Office at the Department of Energy. So I'd like to introduce Representative Tonko. Congressman Paul Tonko is an 8th-term member of the U.S. House of Representatives, representing New York's 20th Congressional District in the Capital Region, including the cities of Albany, Schenectady, Troy, and Saratoga Springs. Representative Tonko is the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Environment, Manufacturing, and Critical Materials. In addition to serving on the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Energy, Climate, and Grid Security, and Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, he is also a member of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Along with his committee duties, Tonko co-chairs the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition and the Addiction Treatment and Recovery Caucus. Representative Tonko, we're hoping you can share your perspective on the present transmission void, what this means for our economic and national security, as well as potential legislation that you support that can remedy the present shortfall in requisite transmission that is needed.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. And what a great focus on an incredibly important asset to our national security and our clean energy agenda. Great to join with my co-panelists, and thank you, Christina, for your help with getting signatures on letters to the FERC chair on regional transmission planning and cost allocation. So thank you. I appreciate SAFE's Grid Security Project's invitation, and thank you again, Tom. I'm grateful for this opportunity because it's important for us to discuss how our grid infrastructure is essentially the backbone of American life. Our economic security, our critical infrastructure, and our national security depend on it. And we know investments are not keeping pace. Our infrastructure is indeed aging in a world of change, and much of it was built for a different time, for a different utility business model. Today, we have a much more dynamic electricity system. We have much more generation diversity with growing amounts of variable and geographically constrained renewable resources. We're going to need to build many more transmission projects across the states, across our region, and even international borders. And this is all happening at a time of major changes to our economy and broader energy system. Last Congress, we enacted some historic legislation, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Huge dimensional changes that are historic in nature and historic in quality of investment. These bills are reshaping and modernizing our entire economy. We're already witnessing massive investments and commitments in key strategic industries of the future. Industries like semiconductor and battery manufacturing, hydrogen production, direct air capture, artificial intelligence, and data centers. This American manufacturing renaissance is happening, and is a huge credit to this current administration, to the Biden administration. But we cannot forget is that all of these industries are incredibly energy intensive. And I do know in my district, where we have significant chips production, that this precision manufacturing also needs reliable, high quality power. And I'm certain that this is also true for our many data centers across the country. And of course, this industrial comeback is occurring at a time when we're seeing wider adoption of electric vehicles and heat pumps. We are projected to need a lot more power. We need it delivered to and from new geographies. And we need that power to be reliable, affordable, and clean. There are certainly other tools that can help improve grid management, like energy efficiency, demand response, reconductoring of existing lines to maximize their performance. We're going to need them all, but we cannot accomplish all of our economic and clean energy goals, maximizing this historic opportunity to grow new domestic industries and achieve climate targets without a massive expansion of new transmission infrastructure. I have worked on transmission issues for many decades, going back to days in New York State government, when I actually was working at the Department of Public Service, and then went into the State Assembly and ended up serving as energy chair, and then at NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And you understood right from the very beginning that these systems were designed for regional transmission of electrons. They were serving a certain area, and then we expected them to deliver region to region, state to state, and now nation to nation. A clarion call for reform and investment. I can confidently tell you, it hasn't always been considered such a critical issue for the broader public or even the broader energy policy community. But today, there is an emerging consensus that building new lines is the linchpin to our clean energy transition. And I do believe that all the evidence points to those projects also having significant reliability and consumer benefits if they are built in a well-planned manner. So I'm very grateful that Secretary Granholm, Maria Robinson, Jeff, who's our fellow panelist here, and Jeff Dennis, and many others at DOE and FERC are working so hard to get this right. And I can attest that Democratic members of Congress are also highly prioritizing transmission as part of any future discussions on permitting reform. So I earnestly appreciate the attention that this is all getting, and the work SAFE and others are doing to draw the connection to our grid needs as not just about building more clean energy generation, but also supporting our economic and our national security interests, both today and for the future. So I thank you very much for including me in today's discussion. I look forward to hearing from Jeff and Christina, and I do know that coming together at a common table, working with open mind and open strategies, we can accomplish a great deal and make certain that we leave this system in much stronger condition than what we've inherited. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Representative Tonko. Some really resonating remarks. I particularly appreciate the line where you say building new lines is the actual linchpin to our energy transition. And of course, tying in both economic and national security, which are very closely tied to the need for incremental transmission. I wanted to turn it over to Jeff Dennis, for a few minutes. Jeff Dennis is the Deputy Director for Transmission at the Grid Deployment Office for the Department of Energy. Jeff leads the Grid Deployment Office's Transmission Division, which facilitates transmission deployment, supports robust transmission planning, and addresses transmission siting and permitting challenges to ensure both grid reliability and resilience. So Jeff, I wanted to ask you, the DOE released their transmission needs study, which underscores that most areas in the United States do not have adequate transmission and are actually investing less in transmission today than they were even 5 and 10 years ago. To get the conversation started, can you give us a quick overview of the DOE transmission needs study, some of the key findings around that, and what potential remedies are out there for the current transmission crisis?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you, Representative Tonko, as well, for the shout out for DOE's work on these issues. So you mentioned our National Transmission Needs Study. This study was previously called the National Electric Transmission Congestion Study, and it is DOE's triennial State of the Grid report. It fulfills a congressional requirement. It's required by Congress. Who has tasked DOE with conducting assessments of national electric transmission capacity and constraints every 3 years, at least every 3 years. And the bipartisan infrastructure law revisited that requirement and actually expanded it and required the DOE not just look at current transmission congestions and constraints, sort of take a snapshot of where we are today, but required DOE to also take a look at anticipated future transmission capacity and constraints that could negatively impact consumers. And so this created quite a new opportunity for us to take a holistic assessment of the grid. And so what the needs study does is it assesses existing data to identify current and near-term future transmission needs through 2040. And what do we mean by transmission needs? We mean areas where we see congestion and constraints today or in the future that are negatively impacting consumers, either increasing their costs, reducing their reliability and resilience, or denying them access to new sources of low cost and low carbon clean energy. The data that we analyzed in the report includes historic transmission investments, as you mentioned, dollars invested, miles of new circuit, those sorts of statistics. We also took a look at wholesale electricity prices and the differences in those prices between points on the grid. That can show you where congestion is occurring, when lower cost electricity cannot flow to customers. We looked at generator interconnection queue data, qualified path data. These are places that don't have a nodal wholesale market, but use other methods to address and quantify congestion. In addition, we reviewed over 100 recently published government, academic, consultant, and industry reports from a wide variety of market participants, folks in the sector that examine transmission needs. And finally, we looked at the results of several different national scale capacity expansion models authored by a variety of entities, including our national laboratories, academic institutions, and leading industry consultants. And of course, what these capacity expansion models do is they take a wide variety of scenarios and they find what is the most economic way to meet future demand needs and future supply scenarios. And we looked at those models to see how much transmission they would build, how much transmission is economic and reliable in those futures. So a key finding of the needs study when we put all of this together is that there really is pressing need for additional transmission infrastructure in nearly all regions of the country. And those needs really span the gamut from improving reliability and resilience, addressing high energy costs, and reducing those congestion and constraint points that I talked about. Nearly all regions in the United States we find would gain improved reliability and resilience from additional transmission investments. There are regions that have really acute reliability and resilience needs, and additional transmission deployment can address that as well. Several regions in the country are also enduring consistently high electricity prices And additional transmission can bring cost-effective generation to those locations and help lower consumer costs. We saw this most notably in the Plains region, the Midwest region, the Mid-Atlantic, New York, and California. Regions with historically high levels of within-region congestion include the Northwest, the Mountain region, Texas, and New York. These regions, along with other regions where we see unscheduled flows, that's where electricity is moving in ways that we did not direct it to move, our operators, which is another way in which we can identify constraints. And we see that in many places in the West, including California, the Northwest, the Mountain region, and the Southwest. Additional strategically placed transmission deployment in those areas would reduce that congestion and reduce the potential reliability issues that can come from unscheduled flows. A second major finding, and really a critical finding that we're seeing across our work, is that increasing interregional transmission is needed to move electricity from where it is available to where it is needed. And that if we had more interregional transmission, customers would have gotten significant benefits in reducing congestion and constraints, reducing costs, and reducing outages. Those historic weather patterns that you talked about, these emerging high-impact weather events, interregional transmission can play a big role in addressing those events to make sure that the system is reliable in them, is resilient to them, and that consumers don't face high costs during them. Our data assessment really showed a need for transmission to alleviate these kinds of constraints across interconnection seams. So across the mountain and plains region, between Texas and all of its neighbors, we saw significant constraints that could be alleviated by interregional transmission congestion. And then finally, the report really highlights how transmission needs are going to shift over time as the clean energy transformation, evolving and increasing regional loads, and those extreme weather events all need to be accommodated by a future power grid. So at the Grid Deployment Office, to kind of wrap this up, we are working on a number of strategies to help address these challenges. And they really span three areas. One is facilitating the timely and in fact accelerated construction of new transmission. Congress and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act gave the department new tools to provide commercial facilitation support, to move transmission projects from the conception phase to the construction phase more quickly, and to ensure that projects are constructed with an optimal amount of capacity, that they're bigger than they otherwise would have been without the government providing a bit of a helping hand in getting those projects off the ground. In addition, we are engaged in several efforts to enhance transmission planning, to look beyond the typical and sort of historic way that utilities have planned transmission to meet their own needs, to meet regional needs, to look at these broader interregional needs, to look at more scenarios of future demand growth, of future supply constraints, of future clean energy development, and identify more dynamic solutions to meet those needs. And finally, we're focused on siting and permitting. Siting and permitting is a key challenge. We can commercially facilitate transmission. We can plan transmission really well, but we have to be able to strengthen our permitting processes to ensure that they're more efficient, that they move more quickly, and that they address impacts of transmission on stakeholders, on communities, and so that these transmission projects really are gain the public support that we need to make sure that we really accelerate transmission deployment. So that is kind of our three-phase strategy of solutions that we're working on, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Very good. Wow, it sounds like you've just got a whole lot of extra time on your hands with everything that you went through here. I'll tell you, music to my ears on so many respects, particularly around interregional transmission and transfer capability. And we look at what happened with Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, and the lack of interconnectivity between ERCOT and the Western interconnection and the Eastern interconnection. And then also understanding that from an economic standpoint, these projects pay for themselves over time. So very interesting perspective. I like what you mentioned about acceleration and looking at optimal capacity as well, and of course, low cost in the transmission planning process. I wanted to turn it over to Christina Hayes for a little bit here. Christina Hayes is the Executive Director of Americans for Clean Energy Grid. She previously served as Vice President for Federal Regulatory Affairs at Berkshire Hathaway Energy. She's been an energy regulatory attorney for nearly 20 years, helping Midwestern and Western utilities navigate FERC, NERC, and other federal agencies. And I also appreciate that the two of you used to work together at FERC many years ago. Well, not many years ago. I shouldn't use the term many, right? That's a qualitative term. So in any event, Christina, you have pushed for an upcoming, quote, strong rule around transmission permitting reform for the FERC. Can you please talk about your efforts on this front and what exactly you mean by a strong rule, and what would it take to accomplish this?
Thank you so much for bringing this up. This is really an important time at FERC. Really pleased to be here with Mr. Tonko, who has been spearheading support in Congress for FERC to take this action. I actually started with this with Jeff Dennis more than a decade ago, so a few years ago, when we worked on Order 1000. Order 1000 was really one of the first efforts to look at multi-state regional transmission planning, as well as starting to lay the groundwork for interregional planning. And it was meant to be the first step in what was expected to require some updates over time, and really took some revolutionary steps. So addressing the right of first refusal, requiring cost allocation on a regional basis, starting to take a look at economic reliability and public policy projects. As time has gone on, there was an initial surge of transmission development, but then it has tapered off over the last few years. All of the construction of transmission over the last 10 years, more than 2/3 of it was done in the first half of the decade. And since then, it has really tapered off. And what we're seeing now is we need to build a significant amount of transmission to address all of the changes that we are seeing on the system. Mr. Tonko talked at length about the new kinds of demands that are on the system, right? Bringing manufacturing of semiconductor chips back to the United States. That's going to require a significant amount of electricity. Other kinds of manufacturing being onshored. Artificial intelligence, data farms, all kinds of other demands for electricity, as well as what we're using in our own homes. We had an op-ed published not too long ago with a personal example. My first home, I could not run both the hairdryer and the microwave at the same time without blowing a fuse. So just things have really changed over time, whether it's, we're plugging in our phones, we're plugging in our laptops, all kinds of other devices that need to be plugged in. So we need the transmission to support the strengthened grid that we need to support all of these additional loads.
Representative Tonko, I wanted to ask you, we've seen sponsored legislation over the last year ranging from big wires to the CETA Act to the FASTER Act. Still, it seems like we've spent a lot of 2023 focusing on bills to keep the government open and less on actually getting a meaningful transmission permitting reform bill through Congress. Does 2024, now an election year, does it look to be any different? And can Congress develop the right bill to gain bipartisan support? And how would that be accomplished? And I believe Representative Tonko is on mute.
There we go. You can hear me now, I hope. Right? Can you hear me?
Yes, you can be heard now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Did we want to finish with Christina, or do you want me to answer the question? Okay. All right. Well, as you structured that question, there was a huge drop in enthusiasm from 21-22, the 117th session of Congress, to the 108th, which, didn't see a high priority on some really important issues. That 117th session of Congress was deemed the most productive since 1963, I believe. And I think we can always have expected that we wouldn't accomplish as great an outcome in the 118th. But even with those lowered expectations, many members believed there was enough unfinished work to do so that we were hopeful we would have some good things accomplished. But it turned out to be one of the lowest producing sessions of Congress ever. And so it's why we're seeing so many bills now being offered to improve the planning, siting, and permitting of transmission infrastructure, because people want to turn that around. People have identified barriers to building transmission as the biggest bottleneck to undermining clean energy deployment and the incentives that are included in the IRA. So with that focus on IRA, there are those who really are now pushing for this prioritization of getting something done in the transmission space. I will say that sometimes there are those who see this as a pathway to a clean energy, renewable kind of agenda, which may not really be their bailiwick. So we've got some competing forces here, but I think all in all, people understand for the economic security and national security of the country, we have got to focus on transmission. So I'm going to remain hopeful that in this session, this year of Congress, that we may have that opportunity for bipartisanship. I've learned that it's difficult to predict when that window of opportunity will be open, but if we continue to do our individual thing and try to do that collective strategy, then we'll be ready when that window does open and get this done. So I say let's remain optimistic. Let's continue to work in our different ideas of formats of solution and be ready to go when that window does open.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Christina, good to see you back, still alive now. And I wanted to revert back over to you. I wanted to let you finish some of the remarks that you were providing, and then would also like to maybe pose the same question to you in terms of what does a successful bill look like, and how do you think the best way is to accomplish this here in 2024?
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate your patience with my technological issues. And now that I have the wind up, let me go straight into the pitch. We are seeing broad support for FERC to issue a final rule and update Order 1000 after an ANOPR was issued in 2021. We saw a notice of proposed rulemaking issued in 2022. And so now a large record of evidence has been submitted to the commission to issue its final rule. We're looking forward to it, hopefully in the first quarter of 2024. And there are a few elements that are really important in a strong final rule. Having learned from the past 10 years of experience, a tremendous amount of transmission is needed to meet the promise of some of the legislation that's recently been passed by Congress, and to update the grid for what comes next. So the three things are, right? All good things come in threes. So first, we need to have transmission planning take a long-term look at changing circumstances. So many utilities plan for the future. Regulators require that they plan for the future, often on about a 20-year time horizon. So taking a look at what comes ahead, because the infrastructure that is built is so expensive and has such a long lifetime. You want to make sure that you're looking ahead to what's coming up. And there are a lot of changes coming up. We see a changing resource mix, a greater diversification from coal and gas to also include renewable resources, hydro, geothermal, and others. So really a diversifying of the mix and not being reliant on fuel from challenging parts of the world. So really providing greater diversity in that way. So a change in the resource mix, a change in the load. We've talked about at length about onshoring manufacturing, really being stronger electrification. And so need to be able to meet some of those requirements, especially how important it is to keep manufacturing in the United States, keep cloud computing in the United States for a national security perspective. And then also we've seen a lot of changing circumstances around the weather and others. So meeting some of those new challenges. So for one thing, we need that long-term look at changing circumstances baked into our transmission planning process. We also need to require planning for all economic and reliability benefits. Now, I know there's a lot of look at all kinds of different benefits, some that are agreed on, some that aren't, but the ones that we all agree on are, reducing economic congestion, making sure we have access to the cheapest resources that are out there, making sure that we don't have congestion, so that you end up with a pocket of customers separated from a pocket of generation. And also reliability, having access to all the energy that is needed, especially as challenging conditions arise. And then the third piece is making sure that there is a dispute resolution or some sort of backstop cost allocation methodology. Cost allocation really is the core to making sure that the transmission is built. We often talk about the 3 Ps: planning transmission, permitting, and paying. And paying for transmission is absolutely critical. And so making sure that costs are allocated or in a way that is roughly commensurate with the benefits that are enjoyed by customers throughout the system. And that might mean having access to other generation as an insurance policy, as we see these emergency conditions arise, making sure there is that access to lower cost generation. So making sure that the benefits, the economic and reliability benefits are allocated and that costs are roughly allocated in the same way. You talked also about the need to address permitting. So much has been done with permitting over the last couple of years, right? So that really has been a huge drumbeat, and rightly so. We've seen a number of projects that have been stuck in the system for something like 17 years. And unfortunately, more than one project has been stuck for 17 years. It wasn't just a one-off. And so there are a number of bright spots on the horizon, but there's a bit more work to be done. The Department of Energy, Jeff's shop, has done a terrific job of looking at how to implement an existing statute so that DOE will be the lead agency for energy projects that require coordination among a number of federal agencies. To get that done in something like 3 or 4 years and move it through the system efficiently, thoroughly, working with stakeholders and landowners and nearby communities, but making sure that it is done from start to finish. There were also some permitting efficiencies that were achieved in the debt deal in the last year, but those apply only on a limited basis to transmission because federal jurisdiction over transmission is somewhat limited. Federal transmission also is subject to state and local jurisdiction. It's really a bit of a patchwork quilt. And that's in striking contrast to how natural gas pipelines are subject to exclusive federal jurisdiction when they're in interstate commerce. So really having parity with pipelines, between pipelines and transmission in terms of federal jurisdiction over these high capacity interstate transmission lines would ensure that this progress and these efficiencies that are being achieved through streamlined permitting processes in Congress and at DOE have the maximum desired effect over transmission as well.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Great remarks. I'll tell you, we really are in unprecedented times when we look at just how rapidly the resource mix is changing. And now we see so much more significant growth as well. We also have aging infrastructure. So how do we keep up with aging infrastructure, the build out that we need, the growth that we're experiencing with artificial intelligence, data centers, and electrifying our vehicle fleet, among others? We really just need to build in an expeditious manner, and we need to expedite the activities that FERC, DOE, and folks on the Hill are doing. I wanted to shift a little bit, pivot a little bit. Winter storms Uri and Elliott resulted in, as we all know, significant loss of life. We lost over 300 lives in Texas, billions of dollars in property damage, and the economic harm was just really something that our country cannot withstand. It's a question for all our panelists, but let's start with Representative Tonko. Do you believe that the lack of transmission had a direct impact on the full effects of these winter storms? What could incremental transmission have accomplished? And when we see these same types of events occurring and reoccurring, with the next one coming here early next week, what do we need to do on the transmission front to mitigate the impact of these events going forward, knowing that we're going to have more of these, quote, black swan events, and they're actually occurring more frequently with more severity?
Right. Well, I think there's no question, Tom, that our electric grid and basically all of our infrastructure, for that matter, our critical infrastructure, they're all facing greater stress from extreme weather events. And we know these events are becoming increasingly common, as you indicated, and severe due to climate change. It's so much so that extreme weather now is the weather because it's, it's so repetitious. In this case, the benefits of transmission are twofold. It will enable more clean energy resources, reducing climate pollution and limiting the potential for even more of instances of extreme weather in the long term. And in the short term, it supports our adaptation to our new normal, making our electric system much more reliant. So I think the evidence is clear that if our grid were to be better connected across regions, it would have reduced the damage for these recent winter storms. So it should be a motivator for all of us. And I would like to see two things for our grid operators. First, longer term planning that better accounts for our new and expected climate reality. And second, greater planning across regions that will enable the types of long distance projects that can mitigate problems like we have seen in recent years. I think, we get great benefit if we move that agenda along. And again, I think it's something that can reach all legislators regardless of, where they're coming from in ideology. It certainly is something that addresses the growth of our economy, and it addresses our environment, the protection of our environment, and the response to climate change. So it covers the gamut of thinking out there in the halls of Congress.
Very good. Would love your comments as well, Jeff, and then Christina, for sure.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I agree with so much of what Representative Tonko said. What we see in our analysis when we look at these events, and as I mentioned earlier, what our 2023 transmission needs study finds is that additional transmission capacity, and in particular, that transmission that is between and across regions, longer distances, has significant value in moving electricity from where it is available to where it is needed. And that's particularly critical in any of these high impact weather events that we see. Those events are impacting our generation resources or our infrastructure in particular areas, and having that additional robust infrastructure to move electricity from other generators who may be less affected or who are otherwise available is really important to avoiding outages and also being able to restore the system quickly so that we don't have prolonged and long-term outages. As I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to return to it quickly because in addition to all my work on transmission, I've worked on wholesale markets for many years, and I find particularly instructive data that we looked at in that study that's compiled annually by Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories that looks at wholesale market price differentials. Those differentials where we see wide spreads in prices on average over the course of a year between different points on the grid. What that shows us is where there is significant congestion that is preventing that long-term movement. That price differential arises because in a perfect system with no or little congestion, the least expensive generators would serve all of the load, and everyone would enjoy those low prices. But of course, we have congestion. There is no perfect system, and where that lower priced energy can't move to higher priced areas, that's how we identify that. And what you see if you look in our needs study or you look in LBNL's analysis is a map that shows this. And it shows darker lines, which shows where we had consistent, very high cost of congestion between these price differential points. And that shows where we have this congestion. And what that data also shows is that much of that price differential was experienced in extreme weather events. In 2022, it was the highest it had ever been. a reflection of extreme weather events in those years. And in 2021, it was also as high as it ever been to that point, owing in large measure to events like Winter Storm Uri. So really just agree, and I think the data proves that out. In much of our planning work, in the work that we're doing in labs to enhance planning tools, we are looking at getting a more granular look at the value of interregional transmission in these events, and also the ways in which our operators, which Representative Tonko referred to as well, can operate that interregional transmission to optimize reliability in these events. That's a significant focus for us, and we're investing a lot of dollars and computing power from our national labs in that effort.
And Representative Tonko is going to have to leave very shortly for a vote at the House. So I did want to ask him one last question before he departs, and then I'll get back to some of the other things that I want to talk to Christina and Jeff about as well. But in fiscal year 2019, the Department of Defense experienced over 2,500 unplanned outages. 542 of those lasted for 8 hours or longer. 12 out of the 15 military bases in Texas lost power during Winter Storm Uri. And we saw 45,000 customers lose power after a substation attack in Moore County, North Carolina in 2022. Furthermore, we're at continued and increased risk of cyber attacks that can also affect the power grid. Do you see incremental transmission as a way to mitigate the potential impacts of these situations?
Absolutely. There's a need for a very strategic approach here. The bottom line is our critical infrastructure, our economy, and our national security, Tom, are all at risk if we cannot maintain reliable power. So it's imperative that we plan for and seek to mitigate those threats, whether it's cybersecurity or terrorist attacks or simply natural disasters. Historically, there's been an area here I'm focused on this that has bipartisan agreement. I think there's good support in both parties for the work that DOE is doing on cyber, for example. So I think what Congress can do here is to make certain that instead of falling short in making those connections, that we move forward and make certain that we have a larger, better connected grid, one that spans regions and connects those regions as an important strategy to building resilience in some of those areas of risk. I also believe, just communicating to our agencies that have a say here. We probably have about 100 people who've signed on to our letter to FERC calling for this whole effort for regional planning and cost allocation. Thank you, Christina, for the thumbs up, and thank you for the help. So sign on to that letter. Let's move aggressively. Let's come together, have our voices heard, and move in a bipartisan, bicameral way to get this done. Our country is depending on us to get this accomplished, and it's a critical, urgent, and very, very demanding issue. And we are, I was going to say, Tom, we are in the middle of votes, and I'm stretching this one as fast and long as I can.
Please go. Bipartisan is the key, and thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to us as well. Very good. So now I would like to go back to Christina. We were talking about Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, and really the debilitating effect that it had on our transmission grid, on our power grid, on our very way of life when we're talking about loss of life and loss of economic opportunity. So I wanted to get your comments, Christina, on exactly what the solution is going forward, as we know these events will continue and the severity and duration of these is actually increasing over time.
Thanks for raising the issue around interregional transmission. So just to clarify, what happened during Winter Storm Uri was that Texas was only able to import about 800 megawatts of energy from its neighbors. For a number of reasons, it does not have significant transmission connecting it to the regions around it. On the other hand, in the Midwest, just north of Texas, they were able to import something like 13 gigawatts from PJM, its neighbor to the east, and then in turn was able to share some significant portion of that with SBP, its neighbor to the west. And so you saw the difference between outages, rolling outages of something like 3 hours or so in the Midwest in MISO and SBP, in contrast to 3-day outages in Texas, and the very extreme impacts that attended those outages. And so one of the ways to address this is to facilitate additional interregional transmission, which is something that Jeff and his colleagues with the Department of Energy have been actively doing through financing, through various programs. They've been doing a terrific job. Those are projects that are undertaken, 1 and 2 at a time by independent developers. Something that would be helpful to do on a more coordinated basis would be for FERC to look at interregional planning once the regional planning rule has issued. It will really be time. As I noted earlier, in Order 1000, interregional planning was teed up, but it's really time to make further progress on that. There are a number of inputs to be considered. So in the debt deal, there was a study that was sent to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, as Tom knows. And NERC is taking a look at what sort of minimum transfer capacity would be required between regions in order to address reliability challenges. That study they're doing a terrific job. They've been doing wonderful outreach to stakeholders, working with utilities and communities, taking a look at the analysis that's needed. They plan on doing it not just once, but on a repeated basis, now integrating this as part of their analysis going forward. So really excited to see that that's going to be part of NERC's ongoing repertoire. So their results are due in December 2024 to FERC, and then FERC has a year to make recommendations to Congress. But FERC need not sit on its hands in the meantime. There's both the reliability and the economic piece that's needed in terms of analyzing the kind of transmission that's required. And the economic piece is squarely within FERC's jurisdiction. And the most cost-effective planning which considers both factors together rather than planning for one and then planning for the other. So there's a lot that FERC could do in terms of looking at what's needed for interregional planning, in terms of considering the economic factors that we talked about, the cost differences between regions and how to make the market more liquid between regions to help even out some of those cost differentials, and also to address some of the reliability problems, so that by the time the study is delivered, a notice of proposed rulemaking on interregional planning could be delivered in 2025.
Perfect. Thank you, Christina. So we do not need to wait until the end of 2024 for action to take place, right?
Right.
I'll tell you, it's interesting. Christina, you and I had a conversation the other day, and you mentioned the moniker retain and regain, because when we look at national security and economic security, we realize that what makes our country successful is the growth that we have in industry and being able to power that growth. So it's not only retain what we have when we're talking about being on that global stage, but also regaining jobs. And so the artificial intelligence, data centers, and electrification are industries that are growing, but they're also growing overseas as well. And how do we remain globally competitive with these industries? And it does come down to both a reliable and resilient power grid. But the point I wanted to touch on is recently we've seen this big shift in load growth. It used to be that it was a 0.5% growth from here until eternity. And then post-COVID, those dynamics have changed. And we've seen companies like Southern Company and Duke that have come out and actually revised their forecasts fairly significantly upward. I think PJM just came out and has revised their forecasts upwards as well. So as we experience this growth and also trying to retain and regain, what are the real implications for national security in these regards? And then how can transmission mitigate those effects? I'd like to start with you, Christina, and then ask Jeff the same question.
Appreciate that, Tom. Well, I'm no national security expert. That's your role. So I don't want to try to step on your toes there. But I think there's a real question as to whether or not some of these industries will be able to take off. Certainly, they've been incentivized, but you could have cloud computing in the United States, or you could have it overseas. Semiconductor chips, I think. to a large extent, there are manufactured overseas. In places that might be under threat. So where is that manufacturing going to relocate to? To the extent that we are able to build out the grid in the United States, we are able to unlock so much economic capacity to bring some of those industries to the United States. As new companies are trying to figure out where to build their manufacturing, they're looking to see where they can get the resources. A lot of electricity also is manufactured in places that are location constrained, right? So you need water for nuclear facilities. You need for carbon capture. That needs to be done in a place that has the correct geology associated with that. So there's just a lot of generating resources that are required to be in specific locations. And that also requires the transmission to make those resources most effective.
Very good. Thank you, Jeff. We'd love to hear your remarks as well.
Yeah, and I would kind of pick up a little bit where Christina left off there and focus on one of the things that she was talking about there, which is diversity of our energy supplies and diversity of our electricity supplies. Our electricity is most secure and most reliable, resilient, and secure when we have a diversity of sources, when we're not overly dependent on every single source. And what we've seen is that transmission, regional transmission, interregional transmission is one of the key ways in which we unlock that diversity, whether it's geographic diversity, right, to capture solar resources when they're strongest in one area, and then a different set of solar resources, maybe even in another area. They're the same sort of type of generation, but they have important diversity aspects seasonally, even time of day as we move across time zones. Wind resources are strong in some areas. As Christina mentioned, we have great nuclear supplies in some areas. And so I think that, focusing on diversity of supply is critically important, and transmission is a way that we're really unlocking that. And frankly, historically, as the industry, I'm sort of an amateur historian of the industry, and we've always focused on making electricity more accessible. That's what we did early in the industry, and then making it more reliable and resilient by focusing on diversity. And I think what we're seeing now is the next evolution of that. Transmission has always facilitated that, but I think it will do so even more in the future. When I think about national security as well, I think a lot about supply chain and our needs to really bring a lot to make this supply chain more robust and to bring more of it here to the US. And I think our focus in the US right now on accelerating transmission build out, coupled with the investments made in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in the Chip and Science Act that are really focused on supply chain, when you put all of those things together, it creates that great economic opportunity, and it builds these industries at home, which I think is going to support greater security in the future. And you've seen at DOE, not only have we created a new grid deployment office where I sit, but right next to me, literally, in the Forstall building, is our manufacturing and energy supply chains office, which is focused on exactly these issues and also newly created. So you're really seeing that focus at our agency right now, that deployment and supply chain security really do go hand in hand.
Jeff, great remarks. I'll tell you, we absolutely cannot underemphasize our supply chain risks. And another word that you threw out there in terms of diversity of resources, I think we've gotten in trouble in the past with not having diversity of resources. I think it's important to focus on that as well when we look at the changing resource mix and what the grid of tomorrow looks like. We'd like to also ask you, Jeff, DOE issued $3.5 billion in grid grants to connect the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, MISO, and Southwest Power Pool. Do you see more grants on the horizon, such as this, to connect some of our other ISOs and RTOs in a more robust way? What does the general outlook look like on that from DOE's perspective?
Sure. And while I can't sort of prejudge or forecast the outcome of competitive processes, which our grant programs are competitive processes, what I can say is that, so you're talking about the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue, which was one of the projects that was selected for an award under our Grid Resilience and Innovation Partnerships Program. And that is about a $10.5 billion total grant opportunity provided by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that allows the department to invest in innovative energy projects, large energy projects, really across the system, including transmission. And we saw one of the largest awards there to this joint targeted interconnection queue process, which was joint planning done by Southwest Power Pool and Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, two of our regional transmission organizations, who together looked at what the need was and the opportunity along the seam, along the border between the two of them. We call them seams because of the way they're intertwined. They look more like seams, to understand how transmission built in that area could really enhance reliability and resilience and unlock the opportunity to interconnect much more generation, much of it renewable generation, much of it wind and solar. And so we've recently issued, and concept papers, that's sort of the initial way you apply to our programs, are due this month. We've issued made a second round of funding from that Grid Resilience Innovation Partnerships, or GRIP program, available. And in the funding opportunity announcement, we have emphasized the department's desire to see more transmission projects, to see more interregional transmission project proposals. So we'll see what we get. We'll see how the competitive process shakes out. But certainly the department, in its second funding opportunity announcement, has put an emphasis on those.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the very enlightening remarks from Christina and Jeff, as well as Representative Tonko. I did want to, there's a minute or so left, and I did have some questions from the audience that I don't think I'll be able to get to, because I wanted to do just a couple last plugs for me and for SAFE. But number one, I'd like for our audience to be on the lookout for an op-ed that has been penned by Admiral Michelle Howard, who co-chairs our Consortium for Grid Security. The op-ed will focus entirely on national security and the link to transmission and the desperate need that we have for incremental transmission. And then I also wanted everybody to be on the lookout for our upcoming report, which is the second in the Grid in Peril series, and it'll be the Grid in Peril transmission report. And so expect that here most likely in the month of February. And then the last thing, again, I wanted to put in a plug for our Solving the Global Power Puzzle SAFE Summit in Washington, D.C. on March 12th and 13th. And we will be sending registrants further information on our summit, and really hope that you can join us. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Jeff. Couldn't do it without you. Your expertise is important for paving the future for transmission in our power grid. And we will be in touch. And thank you, everybody, for your participation today.
Thank you.